Good morning. How is everyone? So today we're going to look at this text, Sapiens, A Brief History of Mankind, and we're going to look at the foundational elements of human nature that make our particular social lives, our intimate lives, our personal lives, our connectedness with other people, the particular way they are. Human beings live within a certain type of community, what I'm going to say is a distinctly human community, right? We are a human animal, which means as an animal or a biological being, a mammal, a large mammal, we have many traits obviously in common with other mammals. And other mammals, many of them are very intelligent. They have the same basic biological needs that we have. They also have forms of communication. They have forms of social life. They even have the buddings of what we would call a kind of a moral life, right? In terms of innate or evolutionary developed notions of right and wrong that turn out to be beneficial for the survival of the species. So what we're going to look at today are the biological or evolutionary foundations of human community. And the basic premise is this, and it will be a premise throughout the entire course, but we're going to look at it from different perspectives that I'll mention in just a moment. That human nature, premise is human nature being what it is, manifests, therefore, certain types of social and communal or political relationships, psychological relationships with ourselves and other people precisely as an outcome or outgrowth of what we are as a human animal. So what we're going to talk about today are the foundational, biological, genetic, evolutionary components that make human beings distinctly what they are compared to other higher animals, and therefore shape their community in a fundamentally different way than any other animal. And the key thing we're going to focus on is a genetic mutation. This is all the result of Darwinian evolution, adaptation, natural selection in the game of the survival of the fittest of various types of species. And of course the question is, what constitutes the fittest? It doesn't necessarily mean the strongest or the fastest or the biggest, but simply the species of animal that is able to adapt to its environment in the most successful way in order to replicate its genes or to grow its species in number, right? So the interesting thing is, we're going to look at something called the cognitive revolution. The cognitive revolution. Now, the author of Sapiens uses this term, cognitive revolution. However, if you look this term up, you will get a definition about 1950s discipline of psychology and the way it's getting involved in things like human cognition, how the mind works as a part of psychological analysis of the human animal, right? So that is not what we're talking about here. The way in which the author of Sapiens, and it's used within evolutionary biology, the cognitive revolution is a moment in evolutionary time in which the human species achieves this final mutation of its genome that provides an adaptation that is advantageous in the game of survival for the human species. And in a nutshell, that adaptation has to do with the development of our brains in size and structure, and the ability in general for something we're just going to call symbolic thinking. Symbolic thinking, something that no other species of animal does really in the way that we do it. Other animals can be trained to deal with certain types of symbolic thought on the most rudimentary level, but they don't develop it on their own, and they don't have the sophisticated apparatus that the human being has to do it. And when we're talking about symbolic thinking, at the heart of this, we're talking about language. Human language is not just a mode of communication, although clearly it's an important mode of communication. It is the primary mode of communication. But the medium of language carries all types of special types of ideas and thoughts that only language can give rise to, human language, that doesn't exist with other animals. And the key thing then is that human life is transacted primarily through language, communication of language, symbolic thinking, and in a nutshell, what does that all create? It's going to create human culture. And what I mean by human culture is almost an environment, cognitively, socially, politically, religiously, and physically, that we create as something man-made that goes beyond just what our genes give us, right? So the key thing is here, evolution, and the last final mutation that's called the cognitive revolution is going to give us the power, the potentiality, the faculties, the capacity to create language, symbolic thought, and culture. But the important thing is culture is not found in our genes. It's something that's passed down from one generation to the next. And the world we live in many ways, is the world of culture and not nature. Now, nature is never, and we'll talk about exactly what we mean by these distinctions. Nature is never that far away, but we live in an increasingly man-made world. And culture you might think of as the virtual reality that is the matrix of human existence. And of course, in the movie The Matrix, you have a depiction of a virtual reality that is a computer-based reality or a computer metaphor. It's a digital reality, right? Because we're in the age of computers, and it's an appropriate metaphor. It's not a new metaphor, the Matrix. And of course, culture is this thing that's built on the physical world that is somehow virtual. It goes beyond just the physical world. And it's the world we really inhabit. It's the world of all human relationships, right? And because of culture, because of language, because of symbolic thinking, human beings are going to be able to engage in types of relationships built on those things that are profoundly distinct from any other animal on the planet. And if you want the proof, you need only look at what monkey societies do compared to human societies. You ask yourself, where are the great pyramids of monkey society? Where is the great government of monkey society? Where is the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence of monkey society? Find me the Shakespeare of the monkeys. Find me the Quentin Tarantino of the monkeys, right? And on and on and on. And of course the answer is, well, that's a silly question because they don't exist. They don't exist. And why don't they exist, right? Monkeys look different from us, but the real difference is not the way they look so much as what their brains, or you could say their minds, are unable to do. And that is to produce culture because they don't have symbolic thinking, right? So throughout this course, we're going to look at friendship from a variety of perspectives. And here with Sapiens, we're starting at the foundation. Human nature is interesting precisely because of the cognitive revolution. We have a first nature and a second nature. The first nature is one we all understand. It's rooted in biology. It's rooted in genetics. It's rooted in the hardwired predispositions of our being. Our body does all kinds of things that we don't choose to do, that it simply does as a result of our biological makeup, right? But we also have a second nature that is the byproduct of this first nature, because our first nature is distinct and in many ways special from other animals, right? So throughout this course, we're going to look at this biological point of view today. We're going to look at the social view of interpersonal relationships. We're going to look at the moral aspect of relationships. Morality has to do with what we think is right and what we think is wrong. We often think of morality as like people having conscience and always doing the right thing and giving themselves up to a code of rigorous moral principles. But I include that in terms of the moral analysis. But what we're talking about more broadly with morality is simply that human beings live not simply by reactions to pleasure and pain, but by codes of right and wrong, good and bad, good and evil, just and unjust, beneficial and harmful. Or if not codes, our opinions of those things, the way they appear to us. And every day we make a decision about everything we do. It's based on some notion of whether we think it's good or bad, right or wrong, good or evil, just or unjust. One of those types of interrelated moral frameworks, right? And of course we do what we think is right rather than what we think is wrong. So these are rules of conduct, and you immediately become aware as you grow up that the people you're connected to are almost always those people who hold a common moral framework with you in the broadest sense. You have a common conception of right and wrong, because if you had a different conception, we'll look at it, there are probably reasons why you wouldn't be able to be friends, or you wouldn't want to be friends with them. Then we'll look at the political framework. Politics, as understood by Aristotle, sets up this broad framework that is an edifice, you say government, an edifice or an institution that allows us as citizens, not merely private individuals in our homes making money and enjoying bodily pleasures, as citizens coming together and deliberating and making choices about what we think is right and wrong, and not merely living by mere opinions, but by taking those opinions and instantiating them in laws that have the force of law, have the police behind them, they're not just words laws, they have teeth, because if you break those laws, if you break those barriers, if you break those fences, there are physical consequences that most people would want to avoid, right? And Aristotle is going to talk about politics as the domain, the place in human life where we come together to make collective decisions about how we want to live that are going to be manifest in law, right? And this might be the highest vision of what politics really is about, shaping our own ways of life. Today we think about it, two questions that come from a famous study in politics. Who rules and who gets what? Which is to say, number one, who has the power, and how is the pie, the economic pie, going to be distributed? These are almost solely the questions we think about in our immediate understanding of politics. But even that deteriorated understanding and diminished, I would say, understanding of politics is still derivative of this larger question of how we should live our lives collectively, and what kind of rules moral rules, there's still morality is involved here, that we want to live by. And then the last one, the psychological. Now, in some sense, psychology has to do with, the heart and mind, the cognition of the human being. And all these topics, 1 through 5, deal with some aspect of psychology. But what we particularly tend to mean when we talk about psychology is the inner life, the inner reality of the human individual and what goes on inside them. And in this sense, how that inner life relates to other human beings. So toward the end of the course, we're going to focus a little more on the inner life, particularly in 1984 and Othello. And 1984 is an interesting example in which there is a powerful, a man living in a totalitarian regime, George Orwell's 1984, in which there's a powerful interface and awareness between the political regime that he's living under, the totalitarian regime he's living under, and the possibility of various types of psychological existence, right? We think of our inner life as the one place that we have the most freedom to explore, to express, because it's this kind of private world between our ears. But we see that in 1984, that part of the mechanisms of control of the regime are literally to almost reach into your mind and reach into your heart and shape you in very rigid and fixed ways and limit, through a kind of radical form of totalitarian political correctness, what you can think, what you can feel, and therefore what you can be and what you can express. Okay. So this is going to be a fairly extended video, but here on this slide, I'm establishing the framework for everything that's vital, the key high points, the key themes, the key bullet points that you want to keep in mind as a kind of roadmap for everything we're trying to extract from this Sapiens article or book. So the first thing is that human sociality, in its particular nature, as distinct from other animals, is the result, obviously, of some type of genetic mutation which becomes an adaptation in the service of natural selection for the survival, so-called survival of the fittest, right? This cognitive revolution, number 2, is clearly, not only is it the result of a mutation, but it becomes an advantageous adaptation that helps us in, if you talk to biologists, they call it the game of life. All these species competing with scarce resources, trying to survive the most successfully, and maybe either coexist or dominate. So it's this cognitive revolution that is going to set the ball rolling for humanity on a path toward which it creates civilization and culture itself, number 1, and it starts to attempt to control or to conquer both nature and human nature. And in fact, when you look at 1984, what you see, totalitarianism, by definition, is a type of political regime, a type of government structure that is determined to conquer human nature itself, to thwart, inhibit, or just plain eradicate certain what I would see, and many others would see as certain fundamental mental elements of human nature that are inextricable, that you can't erase. And there's a great problem when you attempt to erase them. We'll talk about that more. So the cognitive revolution is a broad umbrella term for this genetic mutation that changes the human brain and therefore the human mind, and allows for symbolic thinking, and language is our primary form of symbolic thinking, but you could think of the language of mathematics, you could think of computer programming. These are all symbolic languages. And human language, speech, is often just called natural language because it emerged kind of evolutionarily and historically, and it wasn't contrived by any particular person, whereas like mathematics and computer languages are ones that are more artificially created for a specific need, right? Language. Language has 2 primary you could say sub-functions, because obviously one of the primary functions of language, or the primary function of language, is to communicate, to transmit some type of information from one human being to another, but also to yourself. It's one thing to observe something, and it's another thing to digest it and understand it. So you might observe something and get those facts, but you could actually communicate to yourself to help to clarify the exact nature of what you think you saw, and its meaning and its significance, and therefore maybe how you should act in the future based on your understanding, right? So language, we understand it's presupposed that the function of language is communication, right? Transmission of some type of information. Here we get 2 types of information that can be communicated. One function of language is descriptive. It has the ability to describe the physical plant, the physical reality of the world, right? It's cold, it's hot, there's a mountain there, there's a lion there, there's an eagle overhead, this is a good place for a settlement because it's green and grassy. So the descriptive function of language allows us to describe states of the world and communicate them to one another, which obviously becomes important information necessary in the game of life to survive. And of course, in society, when we think of the rat race or the game of life, we're no longer thinking about mere survival. We're thinking about succeeding within the bounds, the rules, the playing field of human society, right? Rather than the elements of nature, striving against the elements of nature. But there's another aspect of language, which is that it's not merely descriptive. It doesn't just describe things that already exist. It actually brings new things into being. And the author of Sapiens will describe these, the creative function of language, as producing myths and fictions. And what he wants to highlight there, I don't totally agree with his characterization, but what he wants to highlight there is that there are certain types of entities that language brings into existence that are not tangible, that are not physical, that are not identifiable through physics and measuring things, natural science. They are concepts that have no specific tangible reality. Examples: God, morality, justice, freedom, right? Even the concept of friendship. Friendship has a physical manifestation, but the underlying reality of friendship is something conceptual. It's a type of relation between things rather than simply physical action. Okay, so one example he's going to give is the Peugeot, the car company, that a corporation is a legal construct. He's going to say it's a legal fiction. It has no tangible existence, right? But then we bring it to existence through symbolic manipulation of language. We say Peugeot is an existent thing, and then we have a car company with, car lots that sell cars and factories that produce the cars, and that thing that started out as a concept, an idea, immaterial, it's like just like air, right? All of a sudden, we give it a physical manifestation, and we give it a reality that it didn't start out having, as it started out as an idea in somebody's head, made possible by the creative function of language. Now, the functions here and the theories of language, they somewhat overlap, and I just try to distinguish, because the author is going to go on to talk about, he calls it the threat theory and the gossip theory, and these turn out both to be descriptive use types of language. And the threat theory deals with using language to communicate threats in the environment, right? And so you imagine if you're in a hunter-gatherer society, that's crucial. Gossip theory is that people get together and chit-chat by the proverbial water cooler, and in the process of something that seems like entertainment or just passing time, they're actually getting important bits of information, or what I like to call intelligence, like the way a spy would gather intelligence or information on a situation to be able to take actions or make decisions in the future. So if you think about life in a family, or life in a school, or life at work, right? There's all little bits of intelligence. You need to know what's going on around you. And gossip, which seems to be this kind of trivial, chatty Cathy type thing, turns out to be a very fundamental mechanism in gaining those little bits of intelligence you need to know what's going on, or what I like to call knowing the score. Right? You got to know what's going on when you enter the playing field, or you're gonna get run over. So then the third one is that language creates an imagined order. And what he means by an imagined order is that, number one, language produces a constellation or a system of related concepts that are creative, in that they have no tangible existence, like God, like justice, like freedom, right? But then we make these concepts real in a social order. So an imagined order includes an order of concepts, or a constellation of concepts, that are then instantiated in the way human beings live their lives, in their institutions, in their relationships, and they create a social order out of that imagined order that takes those intangible things and literally makes them real, makes them, you could say, incarnate. Lastly, we're going to touch on the agricultural revolution. So the cognitive revolution is not really a revolution in the class. I mean, revolution is like a political concept. This is really a moment in evolutionary time. The agricultural revolution is not really a political revolution either, but it's a transformation. It's a revolution in human society in terms of the way human beings lived. They shifted from hunter-gatherer societies to agricultural or farming societies, in which civilization and its complexity, its sophistication, and its excelling toward more and more sophisticated forms of technology, social structure, wealth, division of labor, specialization in certain professions, the development of the arts and sciences, or what we call like the development of knowledge and the humanities and the arts, and all these things really take place in the agricultural revolution, which starts around 10,000 BC, but we really have dramatic evidence of it starting about 4,000 and 5,000 years ago in ancient Mesopotamia and in ancient Egypt. And I describe the development of the agricultural revolution as the moment where human beings become, you could say, modern, and what we recognize, living in a way that we understand. Human beings start living insulated by culture because they build cities, and they start conquering nature by having a large surplus of food that farmers provide. and they start living in a division of labor with the sophistication of knowledge, learning, technology that we can recognize today, despite the fact that our technology, it blows them out of the water. You know, we go to the moon, we have computers that are the size so small they fit in our pockets. But the basic impulse and the basic structure is actually really established in the agricultural revolution. And all this cultural infrastructure is going to create certain types of human relationships. Certain types of human relationships. So the cognitive revolution is going to transform the human animal into one that lives not just by its first nature, but by its second cultural nature, which is the product of its ability for symbolic thought, symbolic thinking. Our first nature is our biology. Our first nature is all those bodily needs of food, drink, water, sex, sleep, warmth that keep us alive. And our second nature is that entire artificial or man-made superstructure of ideas, of architecture, of technologies, of knowledge that we build on the basis of our first, right? And how do human beings really live? We live not by genes alone. We live by culture. The definitive things that we would think that really make us what we are, or as a collective or a species or as individuals, are cultural things, right? When we identify ourselves, we don't identify ourselves primarily with our bodies, I would argue, but we rather identify with various concepts that our minds have downloaded because we've been born into culture and we've been habituated and educated to it through experience, right? So culture, how do you know what culture is? I mean, the word can be used in different ways, but I'm using it now just as anything man-made that is a part of the environment, whether it's an idea or whether it's a car or a structure, an architectural structure. Culture is everything that we don't get from our genes, and we know that it's culture because we can only know and learn about it and understand it and do it through lots of training, right? So a spider does not go to spider web making school, duh. A bird does not go to bird nest making school, duh. A beaver does not go to dam making school. You think that human beings are smart, huh? Well, we have to go to school for decades to do anything in our society, right? Decades, right? Or more, depending on, you're a doctor or a professor, what have you. You're spending, half your life is in school, right? And which is to say, we don't do these things instinctively. We don't have the knowledge instinctively. It doesn't come through our genes, right? We have to learn about it. And you need only look at the maturation period of the human animal, right? We come out of the womb after 9 months, and we're with our parents, depending, or in some type of role where we have guardians for, let's just say, 18 years, the age of adulthood, right? Most animals go out on their own and form their own families within months or within a year or so, right? And some animals live, just as long as, or close to as long as a lot of humans. We take a long time to learn all these things because our culture, any culture really, is so sophisticated that it takes a long time to grasp all the necessary bits of knowledge it needs to go out. You need to go out and function in that world. So we live in this imagined order of which friendship, human social relations, is going to be a fundamental part. So just to reiterate, what do I mean by culture? I mean, broadly speaking, all those man-made things that make us what we are, that go beyond just our genetic dispositions. Our genetic dispositions make them possible. But culture is something we produce that starts to go beyond our genetics, and it's passed down to us rather by hand from one generation to the next, rather than coming through genes. Now, what is the cognitive revolution going to make possible? Not just culture, but I'm going to argue something even slightly higher, which is symbolization. Now, there's much fraught distinction over the meaning between these two words. But civilization, the root of the word civilization comes from the Latin word civitas. Civitas is the city. And the ancient political and social thinkers said that The human being, in light of what it is, demands, necessitates a life in the city, because the city wasn't just a sophisticated place. It wasn't just a cosmopolitan place. It wasn't just a cool place to hang out on the weekends if you live in New Jersey. The city was the place that had all the elements within the division of human labor to cultivate the human animal and perfect it and make it happy. At least give it the opportunity, right? So the city had all the necessary components of a political life, of an economic life, of an artistic life, of an intellectual life, of an entertainment life to some extent, religious life. All these things are really rooted in the development of cities coming out of the agricultural revolution. And therefore civilization marks not just culture, but the highest form of culture that would be considered the perfection of the human animal. What is a city? It's really important that we hone in on these words. A city is one type of many of a community. And a community is going to be a really crucial concept for us throughout this course. A community is a group of people who live together, who live a common way of life, because they're bound together and united into one from many. Into one from many, right? The distinctive feature of a community is not simply that they live in the same geographical area. Not even that they're neighbors, to bring up Robert Frost. But rather that there's something more fundamental than mere geography that binds them together, that becomes the glue that cements them into one from many. What is the root of the word community? Common. So a true community is a group of people bound together by something they share in common. And it's not just anything that they share, like the type of beer they drink or the type of music they listen to on the weekends or in their car on the way to work, but rather a commonness in things that are the fundamental, you might even say existential elements of their lives. Like, for example, blood relationships, a family, race, ethnicity, common religion, common political regime and principles under which they live under, shared moral principles. And as part of all of this, they share a common way of life. And I mean the way they live day to day based on what they believe is right versus wrong, and so on and so forth, right? Their habits and how they view the world. So a community is brought together, as I say here, by things that people live for or by, but also what they're willing to die for. Their principles, their core beliefs, right? And that makes them a unit, right? So we're already talking about a type of solidarity that's related to, depending on how you want to think of friendship, it's related to friendship. People in a community are going to be more than just neighbors. They're going to be friends of a certain type. Maybe not the most intimate personal friends, but they're going to have serious connections that allow them to respect one another and support one another in that environment. So on one level, we are a community as a human species, the broadest description of a community. And that's because we have language and symbolic thought. And if you want to understand human identity as a species, I think this great bumper sticker phrase, we are what we make. We are what we make. What we make, in turn, makes us and our own identities. What are the things we make? Well, we make all types of technology. We make films. We make books. We make language. And our natural dispositions, as a result of evolution, give us the ability to make these things. So these things we make are an initial product of our own human identity as an animal of a certain nature, a certain genetic makeup. The thing is, because we're beings of culture, once we produce these things, our identity gets shaped to them. So imagine culture culture is a bottle of a certain shape, and our human nature is to an extent malleable, and we are the water that gets poured in the bottle. And as we get poured in the bottle, we take the shape of the society within which we live, through its education, through our parents, through the just simple experience of the certain types of technologies, professions, what's celebrated in it, what's not, what's esteemed and what's not, and so on and so forth. So all these things start to shape us in our own understanding of ourselves and the world. So you take, an ancient Hebrew, and you give them their Bible, and they read and they study the Bible in rabbinical school, and they understand the world they're living in as per the words of that book that are distinct from the words of, say, another book, or later on the Quran, or the Greek myths, or Shakespeare in his depiction of English history, showing Englishmen what it means to be English as a result of their history, so on and so forth. So you see immediately that this power of culture actually has the power to differentiate us in powerful ways, because the human being, as part of being a symbolic being, is highly variable, because each culture, each nation, each religion has its own history, its own traditions, and it's going to shape us in different ways into factions that are going to separate us across the globe. I want to step back for a moment and look at this cognitive revolution within the context of geological, cosmic, evolutionary history, right? If you've never gotten this in your college education, it's something as a human being and as a citizen and as a person with a scientific bent in the modern world of modern science, you have an obligation to be taught or to learn on your own. And first and foremost, your school has an obligation to teach you these things. But to get some basic perspective, these are facts that kind of should be in the back of any educated human being's head to gain perspective on where we actually fit in the order of things. So the Big Bang, the thing that supposedly created everything that is out of nothing, happened about 13.5 billion years ago. And if you think about the human mind, we think in terms of generations, 10 years, 1 year, 20 years, maybe 100 years. But when you get to 1,000, or you get to 10 or 100,000, and then to 1,000,000 and 1,000,000,000, you're starting to talk about a time scale that our minds just don't really simply comprehend, because the lifespan of a human being is, between 40-something and 80-something years, depending on the era and the place you live. So it's hard to fathom. 300,000 years later, matter and energy coalesce into atoms. Don't ask me how that happened, but that's what they say. The Earth formed about 4.5 billion years ago. Billion! First signs of life, 3 billion years ago. Now, why is this interesting? Because the way in which modern science has radically changed our view on understanding our own place in the order of things. In the 19th century, a clergyman, looking at the Bible and adding up all those genealogies of so-and-so begat so-and-so begat so-and-so begat so-and-so from Adam and Eve and so on and so forth, right? Great Old Testament reading. He added them all up in the ages of the people and in each generation. He said, well, you know what? The Earth is about 6,000 years old, right? It was created 6,000 years ago. And of course, man was created, and the story of Adam and Eve, the Earth was created first, first handful of days, and then Adam and Eve come on the 6th day, and it was very good. It was very good, right? Whereas, of course, in 4000 BC, human beings were not only in existence, but the Earth had been here for a very, 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 very long time already, number one. Number two, we had been evolving for millions of years, right? Which is hard to fathom. So by 404 BC, human society is actually already very sophisticated compared to what had come before it. Perspective. So then we enter about 2.5 million years ago to 300,000 years ago. We develop hunter-gathering societies. We're itinerant, meaning we're nomadic. We're moving from place to place. We have no concept of home. Of course, home is going to be a central concept to our identity, a central concept to our relationships. Whether we're talking about literally a house that is our home, right? Or whether we're talking about a land or a neighborhood or a region or a nation that is our home, and we are patriots. We are patriotic to that place we call home, because it's not just a physical place, but it's where everybody has a common way of life that we all understand and appreciate. If we went to another place, we'd be a fish out of water, and we'd feel very uncomfortable there. Now remember, there was no agriculture, which means no planting, gathering fruit. So people gathered fruits and nuts and so on. They scavenged carcasses probably more than they actually hunted, because hunting is dangerous. They had some sophisticated technology, but it was pretty basic. And the risk-reward of hunting a large animal was not always in favor of hunting. So about 2.5 million years ago, we start to develop tools in a much more sophisticated way. Now, when we get to the cognitive revolution, we're going to develop what I call mental tools, mental instruments to do all kinds of work. But here we're at a stage of physical or manual tools. Manual meaning the hands, right? We're using and making tools with our hands rather than just our minds. But the important thing about this tool making is it's already starting to show certain types of intelligence that distinguish us from other animals, right? And the key thing here is that, a lot of academics will only ascribe intelligence of the human being when it's in the form of kind of intellectual or cerebral types of thinking. But making tools, being a carpenter, is clearly the exhibition of certain types of intelligence, hand-eye relations, and being able to manipulate things we'll talk more about, that shows something that's going on in the human being that's not going on in other animals. So we've got Homo Habilis, right? He's an ancestor of us. We are Homo Sapiens. And his name means the tool making or tool using man, to distinguish what he's doing from previous ancestors. So you notice what describes him is not simply just a physical change in his body structure that we typically think of as evolution, but rather it's a change in his behavior as the result, his or her behavior, as a result of this development of cognition. But we haven't gotten to the cognitive revolution here, because tool making is something other animals do. They make primitively and use tools. The difference between us and them is we are much more sophisticated in our tool making, both conceptually and also in terms of our manual manipulation. But then also we make them in advance for a purpose that hasn't been determined yet, and we keep them, we put them back in our tool belt after we've used them rather than just discarding them. So we're getting closer to the cognitive revolution. We get our first modern Homo sapien between 200,000 and 100,000 years ago, right? And there's lots of debate about how the cognitive revolution as a genetic mutation fits in with the development of the Homo sapien. But Homo sapien literally means wise or knowing man. So our distinctive feature is not that we're the strongest, not that we're the fastest, not that we're the tallest. We don't necessarily smell the best, see the best, hear the best, because there are all other animals that do those things in far superior ways than us. But we are the most intelligent, meaning we simply have a raw power that other animals don't, right? It doesn't necessarily mean we always use it. So Neanderthal was our cousin, closely related to Homo sapien, but distinct. They were taller, they were bigger and stronger, and they actually had bigger brains. But it turns out what matters is the relative size of your brain to your body. So human beings, relative size, we have the largest brain of any large mammal relative to the small size of our bodies, right? So you think of like a blue whale has a very large brain. But the problem is, it's also a huge animal. Okay, so the cognitive revolution occurs somewhere between 100,000 and 70,000 years ago. And the exact date is not fixed, and different scholars, scientists will give you slightly different dates. The agricultural revolution happens between 12 and 10,000 years ago, and we really have a lot of evidence for it about 7,000 years ago. Just explore for a moment some of the decisive physical attributes that make us human, right? So number one is we stand upright, and what does that mean? It means our hands are liberated from walking and running, and they can do other things, or they can even climb, right? We have an opposable thumb, which allows us to grab, right? When you throw a frisbee to your dog and you tell him to catch it, he does not catch it with his paw, or even his paw is plural. He catches it with his mouth, right? Of course, you know, it's tricky for him to catch with his paws, not only because he doesn't have opposable thumb, number one. Number two, look at his digits. Look at the dexterity we have that they don't. And then number three, his paws are on the ground because he needs to balance himself, right? Important observations, actually. So our hands are liberated to do all types of new things that other animals, for the most part, don't do with their forelegs, right? And it's actually the first major bit of thinking we do, I'm going to argue. It's not an original argument. We start thinking with our hands. Because thoughts can be manifest in words, and thoughts can be manifest in another thing we make, a manual thing. Because a tool that is honed, and not just a stick picked up to whack something, but is shaped, right? We are putting a thought into that object that clearly presupposes a concept that we are imposing on that object in advance. So some big changes. Australopithecus, 2.5 million years ago, one of our ancestors, has a brain that is 1/3 the size of modern human being, 450 cubic centimeters. Our brains are roughly 1,400 cubic centimeters. So our brains are roughly 3 times as large. Interesting phenomena. Our brains are only 3% of our body mass, pretty light, but it consumes 25% of our calories, 1/4 of our calories, right? So here's the interesting catch that in various elements of the Sapiens book as a whole, it reiterates that our brains gave us the ability to think in new ways, to solve problems in new ways, distinct from other animals. And it actually gave us a problem, which is that we needed more calories. We needed brain food, so to speak. So then our brains had to devise a way to extract the calories from our environment in the most efficient way possible because of its own needs. And this sets up a kind of feedback loop. You might even say an arms race, a technological and intellectual arms race, where we're constantly trying to more successfully solve the problems of existence because our brain demands it, but then also because it can do it, right? And the first way we start thinking is with our hands, manual dexterity. If you think about what a pianist or guitarist or a sculptor does, right? They could only do it with 2 things, the brain we have and the hands we have, distinct from other animals. And let's be clear that playing a piano is not just or a guitar is not just an athletic thing. It's also a conceptual thing, because training your hands to do that requires 2 things. One, the manual dexterity, which is to say our digits that articulate in the way that they do, right? But then also the mental training to get them to do the types of things that a pianist does. So they're not just training their hands, they're training also their brain to do this. So the important thing is that working with our hands sets up this feedback loop of intelligence where our hands are sophisticated, our mind is sophisticated, or our brain, and we start to use our hands, but as we use our hands, we start to further develop not just our hands, but our brain, because our brains are not entirely hardwired. There's an important concept in brain science called the plasticity of the brain. And most of this plasticity exists in the prefrontal cortex, which is this stuff up here, which is why human foreheads look so big compared to other animals, like a dog or an ape. And if you want human beings to look intelligent when you draw them, you make a big forehead, right? So we're an animal that has a first nature and a second nature. And the origin of this distinction is in our brain development, first and foremost. So back here, back toward the back of your neck, and the part that runs right down your spinal cord, is what's called the brainstem. And I can't tell you every component in the brainstem, but I can say this, that part of our brain is very similar to almost any other animal. If you did anatomical comparisons, you would see that the shape and structure of those elements in a human being compared to a snake, compared to any type of animal, is very similar, right, in terms of what's there and the structure of it. And that part of your body, or your brain, runs what's called the autonomic nervous system, which means all the hardwired things and responses that your brain does to make you live. Let's just put it that way, right? So you don't think about, say, heart, I choose for you now to beat, or blood, please circulate through your system, oxygenate me. There's any number of things that your body does that it does completely on its own because your brain is sending these signals. And you don't even think about it, and in many cases you're not very conscious or conscious at all of what's actually going on, right? So the prefrontal cortex is literally the gray matter up toward the front above your eyes, right? And it's the part of the brain that is malleable, and therefore it's plastic. It can be changed. Back here you have hardwiring. What's a brain? I mean, it's we could call it a very complex circuit board that sends electrical signals that both take information in and also send information out to get you to do things, right? So it's going in both directions. And the prefrontal cortex is a place that literally can be rewired based on experience. And what's another word for new you have neurons? There are these cells that receive and fire electrical signals. You can literally reprogram your brain through experience. And what do we call it? We call it education. We call it learning. And the key thing here is that learning, we do not just mean like sitting down in a classroom and learning stuff. We mean having any experience in life and your body digesting, your brain digesting that experience and reprogramming itself based on that experience and learning from it, right? And literally because the physical infrastructure is in certain subtle ways not entirely fixed. It's shapeable, right? It's malleable. Here we just get I just like these images of people climbing, and the first thing we think of when people are climbing with their hands like this is that it's a feat of brawn and pure athleticism, but really it's obviously at the root of it is also a highly sophisticated form of intelligence, because the way their brains are reacting to the circumstances to get their hands to do precisely what they need. Other examples that I'm fond of, sports. You've got all the sports are really built around being able to manipulate things with your hands in very specific, very precise ways. Think about the pleasure, a middle-aged guy takes in a nice spiral on a football. I don't know if we're so lost in the politics of football and all these sports that we can't just appreciate the basic athletic actions. All right, so there's two great books I just kind of mention in passing here that illustrate the way in which we think with our hands and how central our hands are to human culture. Because before we're making things explicitly with our minds and our words, our vocal cords, we're making things with our hands that show intelligence. So let's be clear on what making a tool really signifies. Making a tool really signifies a basic level of conceptual thinking or symbolic thinking is at work, because you've taken the object and you've transformed it from its initial natural existence or identity into a tool or an instrument that is now being put at the disposal of your will for your purposes, your human purposes. And think about the intelligence required to see a hunk of stone that is like, it's rolled down the hill into the stream. And you go, well, that's just debris from the natural forces of nature, right? you know, the groundswell that runs under the wall, right? And you say, oh, that's not just debris of nature. That is an object that could be a tool, and not only that, I could shape it more effectively to my specific purpose, because I want to solve a problem that my hands can't do alone as good as they are. So here's the big thing about human beings. All technology is a tool that is a kind of prosthetic that extends our own natural biological powers and amplifies them into doing things that we can't do simply by ourselves. But since we can conceive it, we can build a tool to compensate for our natural deficiencies. And if you think about evolution being about a game of survival through adaptation, the development of technology, starting with these stone tools and going to, you know, the computer by Steve Jobs or some such, right? The circuit board. This means we've taken the game of adaptation and put it under our own hands and our own powers, and now it's no longer in the realm of evolution, it's in the realm of culture. Now we get to the the cognitive revolution. Between 100,000 and 70,000, 100,000, 40,000 years ago, roughly, it's the result of a genetic mutation. It starts with something physical and it ends up as something cultural, right? A change in both the size and the structure of the brain. So the brain gets bigger relative to our bodies, number one. Number two, we get the development of the prefrontal cortex, where we have things like reasoning and conscious thought and voluntary action. So you think about the prefrontal cortex is the thing. It's the thing that gives us conscious thought, our conscious awareness of the world. Are animals aware of the world? Of course they are. But they're not consciously aware because they're not explaining it to themselves. The prefrontal cortex, the development of language, allows for symbolic thinking. Symbolic thinking, and we'll talk about this more in a moment, but the basic function it performs is symbolic thinking allows us to represent our own situation and our own life in the immediate present to ourselves, and therefore by representing the world to ourselves, we can make choices. The animal gets in the situation and then they spontaneously respond, you could say like fight or flight mechanism to the situation. We get in the situation and we don't just go blah, blah, blah. We say to ourselves, oh my goodness, I'm in a potentially dangerous situation. Question, what should I do? Now, you think this is a very sophisticated response, because number one, it demands the medium language to be able to represent that situation to us. Oh, we have a problem. What should we do? The animal doesn't say what we should do. It just does whatever it's hardwired programmed to do, or whether it's basically habituated through experience. But we ask ourselves a question. And furthermore, that question has implicit in it concepts of the past, present, and future. We realize we're in the present moment of a threat, say. We realize we've experienced this in the past, and we draw on those prior examples as being relevant to the present. And then why are we thinking about what we're doing? Because we want to make a decision in the future moment. So we're already aware of, I'm thinking about, say, the pros and cons of action X based on taking a certain action, having to choose a certain action in the future. Now, the key thing is we can choose because we can present alternatives to ourselves. We can say, I could do this or I could do that. I don't have to do. What is the best thing to do? My impulses may not give me the best answer. My cognitive reflection on it may. And of course, different circumstances yield different results. Sometimes trusting your gut or your instinct may be the best thing to do. But the important thing here is that we can weigh and judge the situation. And we are able to envision, you could say, a fork in the road where there are actually choices. Maybe two, but maybe many. Whereas the animal, because it doesn't have language to represent the situation to itself, is unable to do that. So the cognitive revolution gives us the power for symbolic thinking. And the basic question is, what is exactly involved in symbolic thought? What does that really mean? Right? When we think about animals expressing themselves, or animal expression, animals communicate. They have what Aristotle is going to call voice as opposed to language, right? So the bark of a dog, the song of a bird, and so on and so forth. First of all, their sounds are onomatopoetic. which is to say their specific sound is tied to its meaning. So when a dog is angry, they have an angry bark. When a dog is scared or hurt, they have a squeal or a bark that manifests in its sound as reflecting that meaning. And those two are tied together. They don't develop a sophisticated language of expression for those things. It's fairly uniform. So we'll see that when we look in the text and look at the way monkeys respond to predators in their environment, and the sounds they make are going to be onomatopoetic. The specific sound is tied to its meaning. Human thought, by contrast, is symbolic. Now, what do we mean by that? It means the symbol, a word of any kind, stands for something other than what it is. Stands for something other than what it is. And any word, really, is like the variable x. What does x stand for? Anything you want it to stand for, and that's the point. Our words are not that while we have many words in every language that are onomatopoetic, they sound like what they mean. The basic structure of human language is that it's not onomatopoetic, and that there's no necessary relationship between the sound of the word and its meaning, right? So therefore, that relationship between the sound and its meaning is arbitrary. And we can establish any word as meaning any specific thing. And this gives language incredible variability and flexibility, and it liberates us from this fixed relationship between sound and meaning. Okay, so we move from manual to symbolic thinking. What is human language, or what are symbols able to do? What are some key features of human language as a form of symbolic thinking that differentiate it from a dog's bark, right? Number one, displacement. These are technical terms that actually come from an analysis of the kinds of things human language does. So one is displacement, and that means that we can talk about things that are not physically present before us in our physical stimuli. So you notice in the reading that when the monkeys, they will scream, you know, lion over there or eagle above, right? They are doing it based on the immediate presence of a stimuli. But when that stimuli is there, they're not talking about the lion or the eagle. So displace means to talk about something that's not actually placed before us. Really powerful. And why is that? Because we have symbolic representation that can conjure up things that aren't actually present at the time. Number two, we have a vast vocabulary, right? Meaning we can divide up our experience almost in an infinite or indefinite number of ways, because vocabulary far outstrips our total usage of language, right? We only use a fraction of all the words that are possible to use. But what does this mean? We can be much more precise in our discriminations in articulating our experience, because we have so many nuanced words to be very specific in characterizing the nature of the world around us, or how we feel, or what have you. Then we have syntactical complexity and flexibility. So when you think about vocabulary, I mean, really at the heart of vocabulary are nouns and verbs, which is to say there are things, and then there are actions, and then there are like various types of relational words, right? That makes up a lot of our language capacity. And therefore, they can be manipulated and arranged syntactically, structurally, grammatically in a lot of different ways, right? So that gives us the ability, not only we have massive vocabulary, but we can combine them in an almost indefinite number of ways to say an indefinite number of things, right? To be more, to have greater fidelity to the world around us. So we have a lot of different, we've already mentioned this now, categories of concepts, right? I mean, think how the monkeys speak. They say, careful, a lion, or careful, an eagle, right? Which basically means get out now. But we have much greater range of nouns, verbs, adjectives, relational concepts, temporal concepts, the very existence of time, right? An awareness of time is a product of language. You wouldn't have a sense of time in the way that you do if you did not have concepts of past, present, and future, to name the central ones. So therefore, human language is generative. It's capable, with all this flexibility, of generating an infinite number of ideas. Because, number 6, there's a whole series of combinatory possibilities. There's an infinite number of ways you can combine words, restructure grammar to say new and different things. We start to shift from symbolic thinking and human language to its consequences for human society. And the author of Sapiens says something very powerful. He says, verbal communication is a condition of the existence of human society, right? Human society, human relationships are really almost singularly defined by verbal communication and the concepts and the types of concepts that are embedded in that communication. Right? So we have symbolic thinking. It facilitates human consciousness, reflection, self-awareness, and criticality. It creates novelties that are new, better, and more complex. And symbolic thinking leads to the development and consolidation of human group identity built around core symbols and their exchange and communication between members of the community. And the more they exchange them, the more they reinforce their identity. So I give you just 2 examples off the top of my head here. The American flag and the cross, Christian cross, the Star of David, right? To just name a few examples that immediately these symbols are there to consolidate group identity. Not just express how someone feels, oh, I believe in Jesus, or, I celebrate my Jewish identity and Jewish religion, and but rather what they're actually doing is communicating with each other and reinforcing their collective identity as distinct from another identity. So you can see some of the dramatic differences here. Just talk about this briefly, in that symbolic thinking leads to not only language, but things like representational art. So here we have a hunk of stone designed for a tool, but the shape it's been designed in is based on the purpose it serves as a tool. Like, oh, I need a sharp edge to cut something. Here, this is what I'd call a mental technology. Manual, physical technology, like an axe. It's a type of an axe, really. And a mental technology, in which the stone, it creates a kind of virtual reality, like we've been talking about. It no longer is designed to look like a stone. Here it looks like a tool, but it looks like a stone. Here we say, that is a voluptuous-looking woman with very large body parts, right? And embedded in it are various types of beliefs and ideas that art historians have debated over the exact meaning. This is about 40,000 years old, the so-called Venus of Willendorf. But clearly, it's not simply an artistic depiction of a woman. It's a depiction of a woman that has embedded in it key religious, spiritual concepts connected maybe to maternity and the cycles of nature as they manifest in a woman that were important for the people who made this object. So if you want to understand how much we all live in a world of culture, I ask you to look at this image and look at the leaves on the right, and please, for 1,000, tell me what trees they come from, right? So I found this image on Facebook. Some friend long ago had posted it, and they were trying to tell us how out of touch we were with the natural world and how awful we were because we knew all these artificial brand names on the left, right? And how we were removed from the place we truly belonged, which was in nature. And there is some truth to that, the way we live in the modern world, especially in New York City and so on. On the other hand, I think it only proves the point that the human being is destined, because of the symbolic revolution brought about by this cognitive revolution, we are destined to live insulated by the things we make, by the culture we make. We don't just make buildings. We make concepts and we make symbols. And these logos of these businesses are not just drawn images, but what they're really the real function of them is to embed concepts of the culture of that business, of the types of things that it sells and how you're supposed to understand them, what you're supposed to be like when you have them, right? So these, of course, we're all oblivious to, right? You know, maybe is this some maple leaf or an oak leaf? You know, I honestly couldn't tell you. Well, here we know it's some type of evergreen. There's our pine cone from Mr. Neighbor, who likes good fences, right? Imagine if you're a hunter-gatherer 20,000 years ago. You're looking at these plants and you're saying, oh, this one here, this one's good for medicine. Oh, this one's good for, you know, rolling up food in and cooking it on the fire when I don't want it on a direct flame or something. Oh, this one I can use as thatch on the roof of my hut, right? All these have a specificity that for us they don't have. Here's where we live, right? And the important thing is these are all logos of companies. Companies themselves are fictive entities created up out of, you know, boardrooms sitting around contriving them. If you think about them, they're all the product of marketing. And what is marketing? It's creating fictions, creating a mythology around products that then you sell to people, and they download that mythology, and the mythology comes real because they start acting out the mythology that they've been given about the company and what it's like to have those products and what it means about, what it says about you, right? As consumers, we think we're the ones who are the agents doing this, but it's actually the marketing staff that's really creating these things. But they're not just fictions. They start out as ideas, but then we start acting them out and they become real in a way that they weren't at their inception. So the flag is one of many great symbols that illustrates how symbols like this work.